Disenchantment on the streets of Iran. Why are the protesters there unhappy? Will it take a shift in power in Iran's Islamic Republic to quell the anger of the people? You're watching Roundtable with me, David Foster. Well, it had to some the makings of an uprising, albeit a fairly small one. A protest in one town, quickly spreading to dozens more, turning violent in places and deadly, triggered by economic hardships, some say, but driven also by simmering resentment towards the Iranian government.
Ordinary Iranians at breaking point, railing against a system they see as one of power and privilege, serving the elite while those less well off suffer economic hardships. In a country where pervasive security keeps a lid on political protest, tensions have flared. Demonstrations have died down and state media reports widespread pro-government rallies in their place. But the question remains, what has pushed Iran to the edge? The protests point to a climate of frustration with Iran's leadership. A dual system of governance spearheaded by two powerful leaders. Supreme leader and conservative cleric Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who controls the judiciary, military and media. He blames Iran's enemies for the protests. And President Hassan Rouhani, a moderate reformist who champions an outward-looking Iran. The most vocal dissent has come from working-class Iranians who've suffered in Iran's sluggish economy. The promised trickle-down from the 2015 nuclear deal hasn't been seen.
این اعتراضات از طرف قشر پایین دست جامعه بود که دچار مشکلات بزرگ اقتصادی شده بودند و به نوعی میشه گفت که مال باخته بودند تو مؤسسات اقتصادی سرمایه گذاری کرده بودند.
They blame government misspending and corruption. A leaked budget showed billions of dollars going to hardline and religious organizations and proposed cuts to subsidies for millions of poor Iranians. Youth unemployment is high, and the value of Iran's currency is at an all-time low. Disaffection towards Iran's foreign policy is also driving the anger. Iran's involvement in Syria and Iraq has been a battle for influence with Saudi Arabia. Critics of the government say that instead of funding groups like Hezbollah in foreign wars, it should be focusing on domestic economic problems, taking care of its people at home. With Iran's clerical elite under scrutiny and the government's structure thrown into question, can the regime find a way to address the grievances? And will it be enough?
Well, with me at the round table today we have Saeed Kamali Dehghan, an Iranian-British journalist covering Iran for The Guardian. We have Mahan Abedin, a writer and analyst of Middle Eastern politics. The Iranian-British journalist Nazenin Ansari, who's also the managing editor of Kayhan London, a weekly Persian-language newspaper. And we have with us also the historian and Iranian affairs analyst Majid Tafreshi. Thank you all very much indeed for coming in. Saeed, you write about Iran on a weekly basis, 2-3 times depending on what's happening. When the Revolutionary Guard say, as they have done, that they believe these protests are now over, from what you hear when you talk to your friends and people out there, is that the case or not?
I think compared to last week when it all started, it's petering out, that's true, but I think it's too early to write it off because there are still scattered protests happening in the provinces, not so much in Tehran. I think it's too early to write it off. I mean, it came as a surprise to many people, especially in the West, when it all happened on the 28th of December in northeast of Iran in the city of Mashhad, and then soon spread to across the country, the provinces. So because it was unpredictable, it was surprising, it's too early to say it's finished. So it's certainly...
But it didn't seem to reach a critical level, did it?
Well, you see, the problem with analysts looking at the demonstrations and protests and the uprising in Iran today is that they look at it from the prism of 2009, when the crowds were much bigger, but they were mainly
These were the major street protests which were put down violently,
yes,
and known as the Green Protest.
They were mainly in Tehran and surrounding, and maybe one or two provinces, major provinces. This one is spread all over the country, from north to south, east to west, in cities, in an area that covers at least 40 million. I'm not saying that 40 million protested in these events or took part, but at the same time, they have continued. They have gone back to where they were from 2013. This is nothing new for us who are covering Iran or who are Iranians. We have seen strikes at factories that have gone bankrupt. We've had the problems of the ordinary account holders, and these have been in the form of gathering in front of banks, institutions where they have lost all their money. But suddenly now it emerged in one spark.
Well, this is what I'm really interested in trying to find out. Were these organized? Were they the end result of a festering period of massive resentment?
Well, I mean, two things.
Because that determines where we are now, doesn't it?
Two things. Firstly, these things are not entirely unprecedented in Iran. There have been riots, protests in provincial towns before. But crucially, they happened before the age of social media and smartphones. For instance, we had very big events in Mashhad in 1992.
2009, though?
I would go even before. I would go even before that. There were big riots in Mashhad in 1992.
Yes.
There were. Let me finish, please. I didn't interrupt you. There was issues in Islam Shah near Tehran. Now, on the second point,
are you saying that they just weren't reported?
No, they were reported, but I'm saying they're not entirely unprecedented. Going back to your question as to who organized it, the government has reflexively blamed its opponents in the conservative camp for organizing the initial protest in Mashhad, but without offering much by way of evidence. We really don't know how this thing began, but certainly the context was there. There have been months of protests, but these were very specific protests in relation to failing banks, to dubious credit institutions who ran away with people's money, depleting pension funds. So that's the immediate context for what's happened here. But as to why this thing suddenly blew up in Mashhad and spread, as Nazenin correctly said, throughout the country, we don't have the empirical facts, and we shouldn't jump to conclusions. And I think as far as the Iranian authorities, I think it will take them several months to establish the full facts. They've been giving us intermittent statistics and information. For instance, saying 40,000 are involved or even less, and a lot of conflicting information coming out from official bodies in Iran. But I think as far as the security establishment is concerned, they will need 2 or 3 months to establish the full facts as to what has exactly gone wrong.
Well,
just one more thing.
Well, you'll get plenty of time in a minute. Let's bring Majid in at this particular point, because you're a historian, right? So you can look back and try and put these sort of things into context. What is the significance, if any, you think, of what we've seen in the last 2 weeks?
The main problems for these events, I think, goes back to a century ago at least. It's a lack of 3 or 4 elements in Iranian governing: transparency, accountability, and monitoring. And it happened many years ago, at least since the oil production. And because of that, the fourth element is a lack of equal opportunity in Iran. Nowadays, the new generation, I mean, when I say new generation, specifically 16 to 25 years old, they think that...
So well post-revolution age group.
Yes, definitely.
These
are the millennials.
Yeah. These people think they don't have any current opportunity and no future. If you go to Iran, which I go frequently, if you go to football matches, you can see this generation. Out of 80,000 people in the stadium, 90% of them are 16 to 25 years old. And they're chanting against the government, against everyone.
And does the government understand this? Because I know you're in touch with President Rouhani.
Somehow.
You offer him some advice. Is he aware of the the problem? What some people have called a
Yes,
powder keg.
yeah, definitely.
Like
They know that. You know, in Iranian current politics, you have to understand there are some problems that worse than Ahmadinejad and better than Rouhani cannot change it. I cannot change it dramatically. It needs mid-term or long-term changes in Iran. The problem is these uprising or riots, whatever you call it, started with the Rouhani's rivals in Iran at the beginning, but they couldn't control it. It spread to other countries.
This is pure conjecture. This is not factual.
Yeah,
there's no evidence behind that.
Let me finish my sentence.
Well, okay, look, it's a discussion for all of us here.
Give me one.
My question to you was, does Rouhani understand the resentment that may be there with young people, and can he do anything about it?
If you look at the Rouhani's reports and his organization, especially the Center for Strategic Study, you can see that at least 10 research that I'm aware of, of them, they publish lots of documentation about this problem and the problems in Iranian current situation and near future. And
is the determination in these reports that they can do nothing about it?
No, the problem is that mainly with non-elected bodies.
Well, let me ask you
I
something.
think from what the president had to say already in the past week, I think there was an acknowledgement by the government that there is a discontent not only about the economic situation, but also about the political openness. But how much he has leverage inside the establishment to push for an opening is the question. I mean, there's a theory that he can seize upon the opportunity now and say, this is a time to open up.
Does that mean to limit the power or try to limit the power of the clerics?
Well, he's a cleric himself. The question is whether he would be able, as Majid said, in terms of the unelected part of the Iranian establishment, whether he would be able to seize upon the opportunity and say, we need to open up, we need more accountability, we need more transparency, or whether actually his opponents, the hardliners, would have an opportunity now and say, this is what's happening now, we need to crack down more. That's the open question now, which way it will go.
What's your guess?
I think, I mean, now there was in the early days of the protest, there was more, I mean, the authorities held back relatively compared to 2009. There were not the sort of the brutal crackdown that happened then. That signaled that maybe there is more opening now. It has almost changed. I mean, not in the extent of 2009, of course, but now there's the crackdown has begun. There are people in jail. Like today, for example, 2 MPs confirmed that 1 protester died while in custody. So those things suggest...
They say he committed suicide.
Yeah, it's conflicting in terms of which way it will go. It's unclear. But I think when President was elected earlier last summer...
This is his second term.
His second term.
Yeah.
I think there was, I mean, the main base was a bit disappointed that he took on a conservative path after being elected, mainly supported by the reformists.
Can I just throw this out there, and I will come to you in just a second, because you may want to answer this one yourself. I don't really understand, because I'm not Iranian, the dissatisfaction with a president who manages to get inflation down from 40% to 10%, who gets more people into work, and yet people are saying, you know, we object to what you're doing. I don't really quite get it.
There's 2 reasons for that.
Yeah.
Maybe you'd like to go with Nazenin first. It was her turn.
No, since you started, you go ahead.
Okay,
finish, and then I'll have the courtesy.
So basically, first of all, Mr. Rouhani has made 2 fatal mistakes. The first thing was that he oversold the nuclear deal, the JCPOA.
Yeah.
Because he said to everybody, all the stakeholders and the people, that the sanctions are going to be lifted. Sanctions were not lifted. They've been partially lifted. And also, there are many people within the system, including his protégés in the security establishment, telling him, look, we can't trust the United States in an Iranian context. And this was even before the advent of Mr. Trump. I mean, even discounting the fact that a crazy person is in the White House, the Americans would have reneged on the deal at some point. He was repeatedly told about that. Iranian experience in the past 40 years shows that you cannot trust the United States. That's the basic instinct of the Islamic Republic. The second thing, the second mistake was much more recent, during the presidential elections. Now we all know that there's a huge disparity between your campaign promises and what you deliver when you come to power. That's, you know, this is a fact in every politics everywhere. But in Mr. Rouhani, he totally embellished the divide between his camp and the other, and he made promises which he knew he could never deliver. I mean, my colleague is just...
Okay, let's see whether you want to respond to that or add something else.
I mean, we have heard about the reasons and the state and the depth of the grievances and the fissures that are really tearing the country apart, physically from earthquakes down to social malaise, economic malaise. And we are all here. Now, whose fault was it that whether Mashhad sparked or not, we are beyond that. Whether we are pro-Islamic Republic, whether we are pro Mr. Rouhani or against Mr. Rouhani, we are in a period of transition. Iran has entered from a historical perspective into a period of transition, as Mr.
Transitioning from
to a new model. To a new model.
That's to what model?
To a new system where there is tolerance, number one. That is one thing that has been lacking in the country for the past 40 years. Tolerance
Only 40 years. I'd go back much further.
Well, but more in the past 40 years against religious minorities, against women. Women, me, compared to you in Iran, I have half of the rights.
Okay, but where do you see this transition?
So I think
that implies that there is movement of some kind.
There are movements, there is
not
change.
Movements.
There is a movement, yes, obviously.
But
there's not something giving way. It is. You can see it. You can see it in the slogans on the street. If you want to see who is behind it, or what is connecting them apart from grievances, hear the signals, the slogans, and what the ordinary people are saying. It is not. Yes, I agree with Mr. Rouhani. It's not only economic. It is also social. Women cannot go into stadiums. They cannot attend football matches. So it is far beyond that. And I think it is time for the good minds around. I am looking to think beyond that.
Is there a sense that things are going to change for the better for the people espoused by Nazenin here, or are we going to see something that just pushes it back once more?
Mr. Rouhani?
It has to be, as you say, and as she said, as Nazenin said, there's a time of transition, and the government knows that. If you look at the current situation with, in compared to 10 years ago, different uprising or riots, you can see the government didn't have any determination to have brutal reaction. If you look at to compare, I'm not saying it was totally fair and free demonstration, but
2009 we're talking about.
Yes,
it was.
It was bloody. It was bloody.
Half of the people was killed was from the government itself, not from the half and half, almost.
Yeah.
And that,
a lot of lives.
Yeah. The problem is one is too many. I'm not saying is good. The point is. In the last 6 years, at least, five and a half years, the rivals, internal and international rivals of the Rouhani government try to destabilize the government and try to make the nuclear deal unworkable. They said it's not good, it was against Iranian national interest, and they don't answer a simple question. What was the better solution for that after 8 years?
But be honest, the sanctions haven't been taken.
He oversold the deal. That's the problem.
Yeah, you have to.
I'm not saying the deal was bad, but he oversold it.
Politics is the art.
And the one person who has destabilized the deal is Donald Trump. It's nobody in Iran.
Can I talk? Please. Yeah. Politics is the art of possibilities. You are saying that was better. It was better if Iranian could conquer the Washington. Obviously, it was better. But if you can, the problem was that deal has lots of problem for Iran. But it was best possible thing happened. And the worst enemy of that within was the non-elected bodies in Iran, including Mr. Netanyahu, Mr. Mohammed bin Salman, Mr. Trump. And these are collated people.
And we're adding Saudi Arabia to this block as well.
Yes, they are in the same position against Rouhani. Nobody wanted him to win. He had lots of problems, lots of mismanagement, and the government has lots of corruption. Everyone knows, especially his financial team.
That's historic, and you are a historian. But tell me where we're going now.
The Iranian government should, and I think they have to realize the history of the Shah's time in mid-70s. If they listen people's message, they could improve and change. Otherwise, next one would be much more less manageable.
So you think that is a possibility, that we could see some kind of uprising is a word you guys have used, not me, but you could see some kind of uprising that would be strong enough to perhaps destabilize the current regime in the same manner that the Iranian Islamic Revolution of 1979.
Not yet, but
okay, but it's a possibility. Yeah, do you think so?
I think
you talk to a lot of young people, I'm sure.
I don't think at that stage we can say what happened last week was a revolution or even a movement. It's not any of those. But I think comparing to 2009, drawing parallels, the big difference is that the provincial nature. In 2009, it was mainly centered in Tehran, whereas now it's mainly in the provinces.
But do you not think Majid's message is that if people don't listen, if people don't change, then the same dangers are there for this current regime as were there for the Pahlavis?
He's right, because
in the 70s.
After the crackdown in 2009, people thought nobody's going to go out in the streets again. And what happened? 9 years later, people went out. In the provinces, definitely more than what happened in 2009. Slogans became harsher. And then the mood was, more radical. So he's right that if the government in Iran and the establishment fails to listen to its people, it's going to get out of control.
And there is also the danger, as we have seen in Syria, that what starts off on a very local level can be fermented by outside players to their advantage rather than to the benefit of the people within the country where they're doing it.
I'll come to that point, but on the point of comparison between the current situation and the former regime, I think that's kind of spurious, because if you look at the events of 1978, what eventually brought down the monarchical system wasn't protests and demonstrations. It was widespread economic disruption in the form of strikes. Now, the Iranian economy today is vastly different. In strategic terms, it may look the same. It's oil dependent, it's a rentier state. But if you look at how the economy is organized at the micro level, it's vastly different. Many people are in ephemeral professions or ephemeral jobs, part-time, so-called zero contracts. The idea that a strike situation could take hold is dubious. But on the second point of, I think, were you referring to the potential?
I was saying what starts off as a small unrest can be used to the advantage of other people outside the country, to further their efforts.
Well, that's why the role of the reformists and Mr. Rouhani and his allies are very important, in the sense that, and also the politicians from all sides, that Iran is not going to be another Syria. And that it comes, it's a part of working together, engaging with one another. Mr. Rouhani himself has said in his speeches that they will have enough safety, give the people enough safety to come out peacefully and keep this level of confrontation on a peaceful level. What mistake was made in Syria was that they increased it to a violent level. So let's not forget.
But those original student demonstrations in the suburbs of Damascus were not violent.
It didn't start that way, but it is how the government reacted that made it that way.
But there is one qualifying point, if I just may add to that, is that
we don't have a lot of time.
These protesters, they may aspire to overthrow the government, they may aspire to overthrow the state, but they cannot overthrow the established political community in Iran. The reformists and conservatives, they're not part of the rentier state. They're not funded by the government. They are deep-rooted. They're not going anywhere. So this new movement that may emerge, it has to engage with the established.
What percentage of the population is that group that you say are entrenched? Because there are others as well.
Yeah, but that's a different point.
There are different traditional institutions that are entrenched in the history, in the culture and heritage of Iran. And you cannot.
Where's it going now?
just one. The government, and especially Rouhani's government, the whole establishment, including Rouhani government, realized that there should be a differentiation between the people in internal demands from youngsters and outsider players of the situation. I don't believe the situation started by foreigners, but the foreigners are trying to have
and they're being blamed, though, aren't they? By some people.
Yeah, I don't think that so, but I think the foreigners are playing their own games, especially the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Israel and the United States. They are trying to heat up the situation and trying to have their own direction.
Because it would suit them to see unrest.
Definitely,
in
they love to make Iran to Syria, Libya, Afghanistan, Iraq. They love it, but they don't have the facilities to do that yet. But I think this is the plan for Iran, and if the Iranian government doesn't listen to people, they lead Iran to the internal civil war or even disintegration of the country.
So they have to listen, but what do they have to hear?
They have to have a change towards transparency, monitoring, and equal opportunities,
tolerance,
as well as accountability.
tolerance,
Do you
human
see any
rights.
do you see any sign of this happening?
I think
Even now, just today, or
No, now?
you're talking about now or not now?
In
but
the past 2 weeks, no.
definitely they are doing
I
that.
think the response,
They have
that,
to.
the response that the establishment has shown, as there's a relative tolerance, yes, and then there are attempts now, for example, MPs are speaking out about the arrest, something that did not happen perhaps 9 years ago. Again, it's too soon to say whether the establishment in Iran has learned from the past mistakes and are going to change the course or not, because it's just too early. It's impossible to say now, I think, which way it will go. But the message is clear, is that the slogans are getting harsher. People want the better economic situation. People also want more freedom, as Nazenin said. It's not only about economic grievances, it's also about political atmosphere.
You suggest that change is in the wind. In fact, that's something I think we heard from everybody around this table. Where it leads, we don't know. 1979, the Islamic Revolution, one of the first stories I covered as a journalist, and we're still talking about the state of Iran in 2018. Some things never change. Perhaps they will in this case. From me, David Foster, and the rest of the team, thanks for watching Roundtable. Bye-bye for now.